Right, we're moving from the Mediterranean to South Africa, and the first thing we come across is the most iconic plant of South Africa. It's the King Protea. Amazing plant. This is the flower just starting to emerge, and it is amazingly tactile. It's soft, it's firm, but it's really beautiful. And we'll hopefully maybe see it in flower later on. Now I've talked about Proteas before. We looked in Australia at Grevilleas and Banksias, and they were from the very same plant family as this Protea here. And what's really interesting is the fact that they all share, being from the same plant family, we know that they would have evolved at the same time from the same source. And yet South Africa and Australia, and you also find Proteas in South America, how on earth are they linked in? Well, that means that we now know that they all evolved when there was a supercontinent across the whole of the southern hemisphere, named Gondwana, which is, my goodness me, I don't know how many millions of years old, probably over 100 million years ago. They evolved together, then the plate tectonics moved the continents away from each other, but leaving these plant clues. Now this is the national flower of South Africa, is the King Protea, and it's fertilised by birds who come onto its flat open flowers, take away the seeds, and the pollen is on their legs, and they take it from one plant to the next. In Australia we have plants which are fertilised by marsupials, plants like probably the koala bear and other related marsupials. Again, very distinctive. We don't have marsupials anywhere else on earth apart from Australia, so it's fascinating to see how these plants are all sort of evolved with the creatures that they live with. So this is another King Protea plant a bit further along the path, and you can see in here the older flower. Sadly we haven't got any fresh flowers today. You probably actually get hard to see, but if you see in there, this is where the birds come and collect the seeds. But inside here you can also get a whole colonies of spiders and other insects. So for other creatures to come in here, it's also like a wonderful bird table for them. So a really rich larder, really important plant. We've seen earlier Aboriginal art, we've seen some Roman art, just to give you an idea of where you are. Because we're in South Africa, we've got the art of the Koikoi tribe, and which have very distinctive sort of like thin running figures. And this is the tribe that used to live on the Cape area, because we're talking particularly the Cape, where Table Mountain is, and the Koikoi tribe were there, and they were later conquered by the Zulu tribe. So it's often the story of different areas is quite confusing, but the Koikoi were long established in this area, and we'll find out in a minute how they used to make their arrows, what plant they used to make their arrows. This is spectacular, isn't it? I love this plant, and you would have kind of heard of it. It's a tree aloe. Now you've heard of aloe vera probably. It's one of these kind of like a wonder drugs. So these plants that seems to be used for all sorts of medical conditions, and you get people who have the whole livelihood is based on selling aloe products to people. But we've got a range of different aloes here, and they all grow on what is known as the fynbos. And the fynbos is the sort of like the habitat that dominates the Cape Peninsula of South Africa, and particularly across a mountain called Table Mountain. Again, you might have heard of Table Mountain. This is all part of the Mediterranean climate zone of South Africa. And to cope, I mean, it's just a spectacular plant anyway, with amazing flowers. But you can see that they cope with the hot, dry summers by storing water in their thick, leathery leaves. And their spines in the leaves, again, help to reduce the amount of evaporation. We've seen this before with euphorbias. and it also stops predating animals from grazing on it. So again, we get this sort of quite a few sort of evolutionary sort of similar sort of characteristics across different types of plants. But all the aloes have a very similar sort of quality of being able to, if you were to break it open, if you had a cut, if you did break it open, the leaves, you put it on your cut, it is a bit of an antiseptic, so they do have some good properties. I'm not saying that they don't, I'm just saying some people made an industry of aloe, and that could be a little bit debatable. But I talked before about the Koikoi tribe, who used to live on Table Mountain, and I said about a plant which they use to make arrows, and it's this one over here, which is another type of aloe. It's this tree here. It's called the Quiver tree, and it's called the Quiver tree because they could actually, when they harvested it, they could actually cut it down and it made wonderful quivers for their arrows. And if you were to slice open the Quiver tree, it's hollow, so they could also they used to store things in there. So if you went hunting, you could store water and food inside the Quiver tree. I'm getting into things that smell gorgeous today, and this is one of the most heady scented plants in the glasshouse as well. It's called the Freesia alba. Absolutely gorgeous. A sort of thing that people who make plant displays for churches and things like that, they really like freesias. But it kind of reminds me, these are a bulb plant, and it kind of reminds me that in the Mediterranean climate zone of the Cape, there are over 8,500 different taxa of plants. And just astonishing amount. On Table Mountain alone, on one mountain alone, there are more different species than there are across the whole of the British Isles. And this area is the richest for bulb plants like this. But and these bulb plants, probably it's very low fertile soil, and the bulbs can stay in the earth during the dry hot summers and then emerge when you get the spring and the autumns. And across in these displays in the Great Glasshouse, we have an enormous amount of bulb plants, and including some called moreas, which look very much like irises, and they're just absolutely fascinating. In South Africa, most of the plants that we've been looking at are from the area known as the fynbos, which is a big dry sort of scrubby area on the side and on the plateau of Table Mountain. But in the fynbos you also get big deep gullies, and these are known in Afrikaans as kloofs. And we're going to look at one or two plants down the bottom which are from sort of a more sort of gentle climate where it's a little bit wetter and damper. And as we go down here, we have South African plants on this side and we have Australian plants on this side. So I want to tell you about a couple of Australian plants before we get going a bit further on the South African ones, because these are really fascinating. Just have a look at this one first. This plant here is one of the rarest plants on Earth, and certainly probably the rarest plant that we actually have in the whole of the Great Glasshouse. It's called Grevillea McCutcheonii, so McCutcheon's Grevillea. Kind of a bit of a crazy flower, but we've met Grevilleas before, we've met a couple of them on our walk before, so we know this is related to Proteas. But this plant was probably once quite widespread in southwest Australia, but now it's only found there's only 10 plants left, and they're all found on an old garden tip outside a little town called Geraldton in Western Australia. And we have what we call a reserve collection here, so if they ever become extinct there, and quite frankly if there's only one little bit of tip in Geraldton, they've a chance of becoming extinct. But ourselves and King's Botanic Garden in Australia also have samples of this, because one of our roles here as a National Botanic Garden is to have what are called ex situ plant conservation. We have plants which kind of a bit like a zoo thing, so we keep them here in case there is a big crisis, so we can reintroduce them back into the wild one day if necessary. I want to tell you about this plant as well. Now, although this plant doesn't have any nice flowers on, normally they have sort of like a sort of reddish flowers, but they have all sorts of different colours. It's called a Darwinia, named after Charles Darwin. And what's interesting about this is across Western Australia, they're kind of like, there's a mountain range, and on the mountain range, near the top of each of these mountains, there are different species of Darwinia, and at the bottom, it's kind of a bit more of a sort of more of an arid, dry floor. But these Darwinia all evolved millions of years ago when the area was covered by the sea, and the mountain tops that you see today were isolated islands. So they each evolved different characteristics on each of these islands. And now with the water gone, it kind of the story has to be pieced together a lot more. So, it's fascinating that they've survived, but they're all extremely valuable because they only live on each of these mountain tops. We've been looking at plants, their beautiful colours, their beautiful shapes, their beautiful smells, and plants also have beautiful textures. And this one here is one of our most unexpected ones. Its Latin name is Phyllica pubescens. Now it looks like very thistly, a bit scratchy, but the Latin name of pubescens is interesting because when we get to a Latin name, the second part of it, the first name is like the genre, that's kind of like sort of the related plants, and then the second bit, the species name, often gives you a characteristic. And pubescence means softly hairy, and if we feel this, it is beautifully softly hairy. So much so that the staff here at the Botanic Garden, over the years, they've come to get to know this plant as Mr. Fluffy, because it just feels Mr. Fluffy. So its Latin name might be Phyllica pubescens, but to us it's Mr. Fluffy. In Britain, when we look at our fields, we often see a sea of green, and that's mainly made up of grass. We also see, particularly in Wales, where a field's a little bit wet, we get these things rising up in it called rushes. So we get grass and rushes and sedges, all looking a little bit like grass in some ways. And these are kind of like the most dominant sort of plant forms that we see. Now in South Africa, rather than having all the different types of grass and rush and sedge, they have this thing called Erestios, this here. There are 320 different types of Erestios on Table Mountain alone. It's an astonishingly diverse plant group. Then you can sort of see it looks, for me it looks like a rush, because I like botany and I know what a rush looks like. But it's important ecologically. A lot of it is wind pollinated. But it's also very important for the people who live there, because it makes really good roofing. So if you think in terms of thatched roofs, for us in Britain, this is really good for sort of roofing over in the Cape. Now this might not look that much, kind of looks a bit scraggy really, but it's a plant called the wild dagger. Latin name is Leonotis leonoris, and but it's interesting for two things. It's been really useful for the Koikoi tribe who used to live across the Cape. Its roots can be used medicinally to treat snake bites. Very important because there are a lot of snakes over in South Africa. But it's also, if you were to make tea from the leaves of this, it's a bit of a euphoric thing, or maybe not euphoric. Maybe it's should we call it mildly euphoric? It's a bit of a drug over there, so it's a bit of a contentious thing about using it. Personally, I've never tried tea out of this, don't know if any of you. One of the most distinctive plants of the fynbos in South Africa, in the Mediterranean climate area, are heathers. In Britain we have heathers. We have 6 different types of heathers. In the fynbos they have 625 different types of heather. An amazing diversity, the richest diversity in the whole world for heather trees, or heather plants, because some of them can be quite low, some of them quite high. This is called the Christmas heather, quite nice, wrong time of year maybe. But bear in mind that all of these heathers on the fynbos are pollinated, well, they all have different stories about how they've evolved. So many of them are pollinated by all sorts of different insects and even birds. Just fascinating. 625 different varieties. Amazing. Okay, down in the on the fynbos in South Africa, so we get these little gullies, or these deep gullies called kloofs in Afrikaans. And in the kloofs you get it's much more humid, a bit cooler, and you get trees like this tree here called the Butterspoon tree. It's quite a tall growing tree. Kind of got this cute name. It's kind of got these like growths on it which look like a butterspoon. Is that something we're familiar with in our cookery? Well, it's certainly what they used to be familiar with. But what's really interesting about this plant here is its nearest relative. It's called a Canonia. It's a butterspoon tree, Canonia. But its nearest relative grows on New Caledonia Island in the Pacific Islands. Just think of that. These plants have a common ancestor. So again, it makes us think about Gondwana land, the big supercontinent that these plants would have first evolved on. Down in the kloofs in South Africa, down in the deep gullies, very humid, and you get these wonderfully sort of exotic looking plants called Tercia. You sometimes see them in garden displays though, in big posh offices you get these things. But in the wild, I mean, they're a type of lily, and if you were to walk around there, you may be very wise to have a look inside the plant, because you may find not only little white spiders associated with this, which use the plants as camouflage, you may also find little frogs. We're back in a little sub-area of the Great Glasshouse, which is given over to the Canary Islands. And one of the things I really love about this, there's a couple of plants which are really weird versions of plants that we see in Wales. Now in Wales, in our hedgerows, we get these little plants, little pink flowers called Herb Robert. And they're a member of the geranium family. And in the Canary Islands, they get this version of the geranium family. These leaves look exactly like very similar to the Herb Robert, but their flowers, they have these big, huge pink flowers which just look like a big version of the Herb Robert. And this is the Madeiran geranium. And what it's doing is showing an example of giganticism. The Canary Islands are only a few million years old. They're isolated from the landmass of Africa. And the plants that evolved on there have evolved without competition from other things, and they've kind of taken their niches. So for some reason, the geraniums, this plant here, has just evolved to fill a niche, which is much bigger than you get with our own native Herb Robert. And there's another plant here, and this is related to a plant that we get in Wales called a sow thistle. Now sow thistle could grow that high, quite spindly, but this is a giant version of sow thistle which will have a big yellow flower head looking a bit like a dandelion. But again, this is just another form of gigantism on the Canary Islands.